The official Republican Party apparatus has decided to bet on Scott Walker in this fight in Wisconsin in a really big way. Real, live, actual Republicans who have governing responsibility, on the other hand, not so much. The apparatus is on board. The politicians are not. When Scott Walker took what turned out to be a prank phone call from a man he thought was a conservative billionaire oil and chemical baron named David Koch, one of the things Governor Scott Walker got really wrong in that call was the idea that Republican leaders all across the country were going to fall in line behind him. They were going to follow his leadership on union stripping.
I talk to Kasich every day. You know, John's got to stand firm in Ohio. I think we do the same thing with Rick Scott in Florida. I think Snyder, if he got a little more support, probably could do that in Michigan. Brian, the new governor over in Nevada, called me last night and said he was out in the Lincoln Day circuit the last 2 weekends, and he was kidding me. He's new as well as me. He said, "Scott, don't come to Nevada because I'd be afraid you'd beat me running for governor." That's all they want to talk about is, what are you doing to help the governor in Wisconsin?
The last gentleman Governor Walker mentioned there was Brian Sandoval, the new Republican governor of Nevada. According to Scott Walker, Sandoval is behind him all the way. Unless, of course, you ask Governor Sandoval. Here was the headline in the Las Vegas Sun last week. Sandoval won't draw a line over collective bargaining like Wisconsin governor. Scott Walker appears to have been wrong when he explained to his conservative billionaire oil and chemical baron donor that all of these national Republicans were going to get behind him, that he was leading the way. The other thing Scott Walker got wrong in that infamous phone call was what he apparently thought was the dwindling nature of the protests that were forming at his doorstep and that have so interested the nation.
We're actually hanging pretty tough. I mean, you know, amazingly, there's a much smaller group of protesters, almost all of whom are in from other states today. Sooner or later, the media stops finding them interesting. The guys we got left are largely from out of state, and I keep dismissing it in all my press comments. Saying,
yeah, all those people out there in Wisconsin, they're all from other states. Really? Want to ask them? Part of the reason Governor Walker and the Republicans think they are going to win in Wisconsin is because they keep thinking the protests are ending. They keep thinking they're winding down. They keep thinking that certainly the people of Wisconsin aren't really against them. Here's the thing, though. Last weekend, everybody in the country was bowled over. Look at this. Bowled over by the fact that 70,000 people turned out, this is last weekend, to protest against Scott Walker and the Republicans. 70,000. This weekend, it was not 70,000 people. This weekend, police say it was bigger. It was reportedly more like 100,000 people. We are now in day 14 of these protests, and the protests are still getting bigger, not smaller. Scott Walker sort of let the cat out of the bag last week on that prank phone call he thought he was having with David Koch. He sort of let the cat out of the bag when he essentially admitted that Wisconsin Republicans are just counting on these protests going away. From the looks of it, they are not going away. And the longer this goes on, the less Governor Walker and Wisconsin Republicans have to stand on here. The longer it goes on, the clearer it becomes that this whole fight is not about what they say it's about. This whole fight is not about the budget. This fight is about destroying the unions. It's about corporate titans who give lots of money to Republicans and who can get them on the phone for 20 minutes in the middle of a crisis, guys like David Koch wanting to bust the unions. And it's about dismantling a key part of the Democratic base in terms of fundraising. You want to see those numbers from the 2010 elections again? Right. Okay, unions are the only significant outside spending group that Democrats have to compete with the conservatives. Union members also tend to support Democratic causes, and they provide a good chunk of the get-out-the-vote infrastructure that Democrats rely on to win elections. The Republican Party, more than almost anything else, represents corporate interests. The Democratic Party, more than anything else, represents people who work for corporate interests or people who represent something other than corporations. The longer this goes on in Wisconsin, the longer this stretches out, the clearer it gets that this is not a fight about the budget. At the outset, remember, there was that strange fact that the specific unions that would be exempted from the new rules in Wisconsin, the unions that wouldn't get stripped, happened to be the unions that supported Scott Walker in the last election. Then there was the revelation that right around the same time that he claimed a budget crisis, Governor Walker and state Republicans passed $140 million worth of tax giveaways for businesses. Tax giveaways that were not paid for. They were just larded onto the state's deficit. Hey, wait, I thought this was all because you were all so worried about that deficit. Then, as this thing went on longer, the unions offered to give the governor all of the financial concessions he had asked for, which, if he were in fact just concerned about the deficit, would have meant that he won. Game over. But Governor Walker not only did not accept those concessions, he didn't even want to talk about them. And now today, as this keeps going on, comes the threat from Governor Walker that if he doesn't get what he wants by tomorrow, he may have to begin the process of laying off people, laying off state workers. Why tomorrow? Because tomorrow is the deadline for refinancing the state's debt. That is a move that, as far as I can tell, will add another $14 million onto Wisconsin's state deficit. So what's the reasoning here? We have such a deficit problem that unless I can make it $14 million worse, the workers get it? The longer this goes on, the clearer it gets that this is really not about what they say it's about. This is really, really, really not about Wisconsin's state budget. This is partisan. This is about Republicans winning elections. This is about hamstringing Democrats so they can't win elections. This is about the David Kochs of the world getting what they want and what they have always wanted. The longer this goes on, the clearer that gets, and the bigger the protests get. 100,000 people in Wisconsin this weekend. These protests are not just a reflection that the governor is losing there. These protests are part of the reason that he is losing. And therefore, this weekend and today, the Walker administration has taken action to end the protests. Wisconsin's Department of Administration, it's headed up by a Scott Walker appointee, set a deadline of 4 p.m. yesterday for the protesters to clear out of the state capitol. As that 4 p.m. deadline approached, and as a handful of protesters refused to go, local authorities decided that the protesters who remained would be allowed to stay in the Capitol overnight. That was last night. But then today, as the Capitol returned to normal business hours, sorry, everybody out of luck. Protesters are locked out of Wisconsin Capitol. Scores of demonstrators waited outside to get in today. They were ultimately denied entry by Capitol police officers, shut out of the public building that they were told they would be allowed back into.
Whose house? Whose house? Whose house?
This is not a fight between the protesters and the police. Not only have police been among the protesters, not only has the Wisconsin Professional Police Association said they are on the side of the protesters, there's also the anecdotal evidence that keeps getting reported about the essentially solidarity between the police and the protesters here. A chant reported this weekend in the Wall Street Journal of protesters shouting, "Thank you, cops. Thank you, cops." The protesters have gone out of their way to be respectful of law enforcement officials and their demands, and it appears to be mutual. There was the situation of the Capitol needing to be cleaned over the weekend. Local authorities have said the Capitol needed to be cleaned up. The Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel reports, quote, shortly before 8 p.m., a worker on a waxing machine polished the main floor of the rotunda. Dozens of demonstrators chanted, "Thank you, thank you." As massive as these protests have been over the last 2 weeks, there have been no significant arrests. There have been no significant reports of violence. On the contrary, law enforcement officials have at least twice now publicly thanked the protesters for their polite and decorous behavior. An official with the agency that provides security for the Capitol saying yesterday, quote, "Citizens who have joined rallies at the Capitol over the last 2 weeks have been respectful and cooperative, and I extend my sincere thanks to them and to the protest organizers." A thank you letter from law enforcement. When the cause you are fighting against is transparently hypocritical, when your opponent keeps showing himself to be operating in bad faith, large, organized, principled, nonviolent protests are almost unbeatable. I'm not talking about some kumbaya liberal vision of how I wish the world was or something. I'm not imagining here. I'm talking about tactics. I'm talking about political tactics. When there are two sides in a political fight, and one of them has ruled out negotiation, and the other one is a large, organized, exclusively and scrupulously nonviolent movement that persists and that will not go away and that has public opinion on its side, there is almost nothing that can beat that. Wisconsin, you are winning. I will say that again. Wisconsin, you are winning this fight. There is a reason that after all of this time, your governor is not willing to negotiate. He is not willing to talk at all, but he is willing to kick you out of the Capitol. The physical presence of these demonstrators in Wisconsin is why Wisconsin is winning and the governor is losing. He's getting desperate. What happens next?